All right, y'all. So let's get started with Unit 4, Topic 7. This one is going to be about changing social hierarchies from 1450 to 1750. And I want you to keep in mind that we have already talked about social hierarchies throughout the class. Right? We talked about different social structures. So we're going to talk about some of the ones that we've talked about previously and introduce new ones and show you how they've changed over time. So let's jump right in. And one of the first things that we want to talk about is exactly what is a social hierarchy. So a social hierarchy is a system of organization where people are separated into different groups based on their power, their influence, their dominance, or their social standing. Now, there is a question on the slide here. What are some specific examples? And instead of having you answer that question, I will just go ahead and show you some of those specific examples that we've already talked about in class. So first you have the Khmer social hierarchy. Remember, the Khmer Empire exists in Southeast Asia, in and around modern day Cambodia. But here, again, you see the pyramid structure. You have the king or the Chakravartin at the top. You have the Brahmins, the priests, the royalty, the warriors, the merchants, the rice farmers, who make up the largest portion of the population. And then you have slaves at the bottom of that pyramid. And then to my right, you're my right. You have the Aztec social hierarchy where we had the divine ruler, the priests, the merchants, the artisans, the peasants, and the slaves. And I'm going to slide myself out of the way just a little bit more. And if you notice here, one of the things, the questions that we asked in one of the previous units or previous sections is the transatlantic slave trade a change or a continuity in this period? The reason why it was a change, if we look at how slavery existed in the Americas before the transatlantic slave trade, right? Slavery was either indentured servitude or prisoners of war, right? Captures from wars. Now, in Southeast Asia, slavery by birth does exist. But when we talk about transatlantic slave trade, we're talking about examples specifically in the Americas. So the Aztecs are a good example of how slavery changes over time. So just to kind of bring that question back into the conversation. But let's take a look at how some of these pyramids look. The thing that we're going to talk about here is changes in these social hierarchies. We've talked about some of the clashes and conflicts that can happen when people at the top have more power and the people at the bottom feel like they are not being treated fairly. So those are the things that kind of make change happen and what forces change into the social hierarchy. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about here. So let's take a look at the learning objective for this section. We're going to talk about how social categories and roles, practices have been either maintained or changed over time. We'll talk about several different states. The Mughals, the Ottomans are big ones that we'll talk about, and how they kind of accommodate people of different ethnic and religious backgrounds into their society. We'll talk about how some of the imperial colonial powers kind of do things when they come to new territories, especially in the Americas. We'll talk about how the Spanish kind of handle a social hierarchy. So those are some of the examples and things that we'll talk about as we go on. All right. And I'm going to move myself around a little bit as we go because I don't want to be in the way of the slide. So the first group that we'll talk about is the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty here in China exists from 1644 to 1911. It follows the Ming Dynasty. Now, the Qing social classes, which you see there, you have the emperor, the bureaucrats, the working class, and the lower class, generally follows Confucian philosophy. And if we remember back to Unit 1, when we really focused in on China, we talked about Confucianism, and we talked about how it influenced how China operates. Now, the Qing rulers are from Manchuria, which you see here in northern China. And I'm going to kind of give myself a pointer here. Okay. They come from Manchuria. Okay. Manchuria is in northern China. And this is actually really significant that the rulers come from Manchuria, because it is the second time that the Han Chinese majority are ruled by a group of people who are a minority to them. Now, the first time was when the Mongols came down from Mongolia, invaded China, took over Han territory, and began the Yuan dynasty. So again, here you see the location of Manchuria. We've talked about the Manchus before, but eventually, after the Ming dynasty gets its start in 1644, the Manchus begin to put in place some policies that are very restrictive towards the Han Chinese, and that is what causes tensions within the social classes. So those are the things that we're going to talk about in particular with the Han Chinese and the interaction with them and the Manchus in this dynasty. Now, this dynasty lasts for a long time, lasts for nearly 300 years, but there is a lot of tension throughout that period. Okay, so one of the first things that we'll talk about here is the haircutting edict. Now, I've talked about haircutting before with some examples, but the dominant group in China is the Han. The Han Chinese still is the main ethnic group. So when the Qing dynasty comes to power, they're ruled by a different ethnic group. We just talked about that, the Manchus. And China has been ruled by a minority group, again, previously by the Mongols. I want you to have those details in mind. The Mongols, the Yuan, were typically very tolerant of diversity and how they accepted a lot of Han Chinese culture and kind of integrated them. The Manchu, though, are not as tolerant, and they put in place policies that make the Manchu culture the dominant culture in China. And when they begin their rule, they do keep some of those traditional Chinese practices, the civil service exam, which kind of started under the Song Chinese. They keep together some of the structure of the Chinese bureaucracy that the Song Chinese dynasty had started. But after about a year, right, they come to power in 1644. After about a year in 1645, the new dynasty puts in place what's called the haircutting order or the haircutting edict. And that order says that all Han Chinese men have to shave the front of their heads and then comb the remaining hair back into this Manchu hairstyle called a quai. And the quai has this long, thin ponytail, essentially. Or braid down the back of the head. And you can kind of see the images here on the screen. Now, the punishment for not doing this was execution. And you can see that kind of in the quote that's on the screen there. To keep the hair, you lose the head. To keep your head, you cut your hair. So this hairstyle is forced upon the Han as a sign of submission and acceptance of the Qing dynasty as the legitimate rulers or the ruling ethnic group. And it's very conflicting for the Han Chinese because it goes against the traditional Confucian value where people don't damage their bodies or damage their hair. And so for many of the Han Chinese men in particular, they would not cut their hair because it was part of their religious practice and their religious teaching. So during the Ming Dynasty, which was immediately before, it was very common for the men not to cut their hair and to wind it up into kind of a bun on their head. But here, the Manchu want to enforce or impose their culture onto the Han Chinese. So let's talk about what happens when people don't do that. So the haircut edict, again, is a way, and I want you to kind of keep this in mind, is a way for the Manchu leaders to get rid of the Han Chinese who are not supportive or loyal to the new dynasty. And even with the punishment of execution, you still have many who resist and refuse to adopt this new hairstyle. And this leads to a series of uprisings and conflicts within China. Uh, and the response to those is swift and brutal. Okay, here we have a couple of examples of massacres that take place. You have Jiading, which is kind of around modern day Shanghai, where troops kind of sieged the city and then took it over once the city collapses and falls, and they killed nearly every resident of the city of Jiading. And then you have another one in 1645 called the Yangtze Massacre. Here, again, the estimates, well, we don't know for sure, but the estimates are between 70,000 and 100,000 people were killed in the massacre there in Jiangjin. Okay, so these are huge massacres that take place under the Qing dynasty because the Manchus want to, again, impose their will of making themselves the ruling ethnic group. And so that is what we will see under these groups. This is where the tensions arise right immediately after in 1645. So we don't know a lot of the numbers for sure because not long after, the people who were very opposed to the Qing dynasty and wanted to try to get them out over the period that they exist, they start to inflate the numbers and exaggerate things. So it's very hard to get accurate estimates So we have these huge ranges, right? So for example, in Tianjin, 70 to 100,000 people are murdered because, again, there's refusal to cut your hair. So, but we'll cover some of these again later as we go. But I just wanted to point out where some of this tension comes from. So let's talk more about how the social hierarchy changes under the Qing dynasty. And again, you can kind of see, again, the social hierarchy that exists, the emperor, the bureaucrats, the working class, the lower classes. And as I mentioned, the Qing dynasty, the Manchus, keep in place the civil service exam. But one of the things that they do is they make it increasingly harder. So before this, anyone could have studied for a civil service exam, could have found their way into the bureaucracy or even into the working class by studying and preparing for these exams. But eventually, because it becomes much more hard, much more difficult, much more challenging to do, only wealthy families can afford to prepare their children and families for the exam. And so when you get to the end of the 1700s, in the 18th century, the political elite class, whether that be the upper working class or even the government bureaucrats, was really closed off to the working and lower classes, right? So you sort of see how the Manchus kind of uh, putting a barrier in place for the Han Chinese. And again, that creates tension because the upper classes are keeping the lower classes down and not treating them fairly. Okay, so that is some of the examples that we'll see of how those social classes change, right? Rather than everyone having access to the upper class, only the wealthy or those who are part of the Manchus can become part of the bureaucrat class. So, moving on, we're going to take a look at the Americas. So, we're going to take a look at how some of these social structures change around the world during this time period. But the most drastic change comes here in the Americas with the arrival of both the Europeans and the Africans, and how those cultures kind of mix in with the indigenous culture. Now, within European colonies in the Americas, skin color becomes kind of the major factor of how social hierarchies are decided and structured. The example you see on your screen here is particular to the Spanish colonies. You have very distinct social levels that are developed and named, and in general, again, most of this is based on not only your skin color, but where you were born. So at the very top, you have the Peninsulares, who are born on the Iberian Peninsula. They are either born in Spain or Portugal. They are born in Europe. Then you have the Criollos, which are Europeans that are born in the Americas. So their parents were from Spain or from Portugal, came to the Americas and gave birth to them here. Then you have the castas, which are those people of mixed race or mixed ancestry. And even that group is divided further. So you have people who are mixed European, and you see that kind of over here to my right, the mestizos, who are mixed European and indigenous. You have the mulattoes, who are mixed European and African. And then you have the zambos, who are indigenous and African descent. So even the castas are divided as well. And then at the very bottom, you have the indigenous people, the people who lived here already, and the enslaved Africans, right? So those groups form up the bottom of the social hierarchy. Now, the Spanish take this to a whole new level. Okay, they have a regimen here. The casta system is the social hierarchy for Spanish America, and it was very intentionally designed. So you have a series of paintings, which are called the casta paintings. You see them here to my right. They come through during the Spanish colonial years, casta meaning lineage here. And these casta paintings attempt to provide kind of a visual category of racial and social standing in Spanish America. So, starting at the very top, you see some examples here um, of people. Of course, you see the African blacks at the bottom, right? So you just sort of see how people kind of structure themselves out. And the goal of this painting, the Casa painting in the 18th century here, again, just providing this visual representation of where people should fall. So if you were not familiar of where someone was, you could sort of compare them to the images and kind of see where they fall out on this list. Okay. Now, here, these are questions that I want you to answer on your sheet. What was the determining factor for social standing in the Spanish colonies in the Americas? Do the social hierarchy allow for movement between social classes? And then for my AP class, I want you to think of, and we're going to talk about in class, how the Spanish colonial social classification compares to King China. What are the similarities and what are the differences? But for everyone, I want you to at least answer the first two questions, and then I'm going to have them come up here on the Ed Puzzle so you can put your answers here for me so that I can read them. But I do also want you to write them into your notes. So, what is the determining factor of social standing in Spanish colonies? And does the Spanish colonial social hierarchy allow for movement between social class? Okay, so keep those questions in mind. So let's move on to Russia. Okay, so here we're going to talk about Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan the Fourth. Okay, Ivan the Fourth rules in Russia from 1533 to 1584. The social structure that we see here kind of comes from earlier periods and kind of represents a continuity of how Russia had been organized socially. At the very top, of course, is the royal family. Then you have the boyars, who are the land-owning nobles who kind of serve the royal class. Very feudal. We talked in the last section about how feudal systems did not really benefit the serfs or the peasants after it had happened as it had happened in Europe. But then you have the merchants and artisans, then you have the peasantry and the serfs. Okay, this is a feudal system with the boyars as the land-owning nobility. They serve the royalty, but tensions are going to come up between the boyars and Ivan the Fourth, which leads to changes in the social status and the social hierarchy, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. Okay, so Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth, becomes very suspicious of the allegiances of the boyars outside of Moscow. This happens after he takes over territory in this region here, okay, this region here in Novgorod. Okay, and what happens here is he becomes suspicious of them, right? And we want to remember here about Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible is probably not the most sane, right? He even has murdered his own son. He's committed lots of terrible crimes. And so he's considered very unstable. And he institutes a policy called Upper China in 1565, where the boyars are kind of oppressed, their land is confiscated. He then would later go into Novgorod and destroy the city in 1570, leave thousands dead, and move the boyars and the elite from there to Moscow so he could keep an eye on them. It's not the first time that we've talked about that. We talked about that in Japan before, where some of the elite had to move back to Tokyo so that the emperor could keep an eye on them. And the same thing happens here, right? So we begin to see this mentality of I can't trust the wealthy because maybe they're getting too much power, or maybe they have too much influence, or maybe they're not quite loyal to me. So I need to do something to keep them under my power. Okay, and that's what happens here with Ivan the Fourth. So Ivan the Fourth, because of his actions, is the one who changes the social structure that exists in Russia by sort of eliminating the boyars in the middle and sort of bringing them underneath his control more fully. So now the next social change that we're going to talk about involves Spain, but mostly involves the Spain homeland, and it's the Alhambra Decree that takes place shortly after 1492. If we remember back to when we were talking about Christopher Columbus, the Reconquista was taking place where the Moors, the Spanish Muslims, were expelled from Spain. And so here you have the Catholic monarchs of Ferdinand and Isabella who give all practicing Jews just a few months to leave Spain and leave and find another place to go. And the reasoning behind that is they were scared that the Spanish population, which had previously converted from Judaism to Catholicism, would go back to Judaism if given the chance. So the population under the Spanish crown is called conversos. Okay, so by expelling the Jews, Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to keep control over the current Catholic population, kind of preserve the state as a Christian Catholic state. And most of the Spanish Jews make their way to the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. So we'll talk about that. And then you can sort of think about how that applies to things that we see existing in current events today. So when the Alhambra Decree is announced in 1492, Spanish Jews and Jews from Spain and Portugal, and I'm going to move myself around a little bit, leave the Iberian Peninsula, leave Spain and Portugal. Some of them go to Northern Africa. You can kind of see some of the routes they take here. Some of them make their way to parts of Italy and Sicily and maybe into Greece. And a lot of them go into the Ottoman Empire. And we're going to take a look specifically at how they exist in the Ottoman Empire on the next slide. Ooh, where can I put myself? So the Ottoman Empire had been home to Jews before, prior to the persecution of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. But the Ottomans allowed a lot more freedoms to Jews. This is why a lot of them tend to go here than other regions such as North Africa. Excuse me. Now, Sultan Bayezid of the Ottoman Empire, who's the son of Mehmed II, not only allowed Jews from Spain to resettle in the empire, but he actually sent the Ottoman Navy. You can see an example of an Ottoman naval ship here that was sent to evacuate the Jews from Spain in 1492. And he is also quoted, right? He felt that the Ottoman Empire could benefit a lot from the Jewish people, that they had a lot to offer to the Ottoman Empire, and he made fun of or ridiculed Ferdinand and Isabella for expelling them. Now, the quote you see here, right? You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine, right? So Sultan Bayezid sees the Jews as a benefit that will enrich his own empire, enrich the Ottoman Empire, and it'll be a negative for the Spanish Empire to have kicked them out as a whole. So social classes within the Ottoman Empire are very complex. I'm going to see where I can put myself. All right. The empire is very large. It's very socially diverse. It has multiple ethnic groups. It has multiple faiths, Jews, Muslims, Christians, etc. But there is a clear elite social class that was very militaristic in nature. And if we remember back to when we talked about the Ottoman Empire, we had a military class called the Janissaries. So the elite military members, like the Janissaries, have a very high status and could receive land through the Timar system. The Timar system is a system where the Ottoman Sultan granted land or tax revenue to those that he favored. So mostly it would go to people who would help the empire expand. Now, non-Muslims, which include the Jews that we just talked about, were subject to a jizya tax. They were very autonomous, right? They still had rights within the empire, but they still had to pay a tax. They had some other restrictions. They generally enjoyed a high level of autonomy, but there were some restrictions as to things they could do within the empire. And of course, they had to pay the jizya tax for being non-Muslim. If they wanted to avoid paying the jizya tax, if you remember, they had to convert to Islam, right? So they had to become Muslim to avoid the jizya tax. Now, women in particular would hold the social status that their husbands had. They do have certain rights under Islamic law. They do have the right to divorce. They do have the right of inheritance in some cases. But generally speaking, they hold the social class of their husband. There is an era within the Ottoman Empire from 1533 to 1656 that we call the Sultanate of Women, right? It begins with this woman right here, Roxelana, who comes to the Ottoman Empire as a slave. She enters the harem of Suleiman the Magnificent, and eventually Suleiman marries her. It makes her the most powerful woman in the empire, makes her his wife. Before that, sultans really didn't officially marry anyone, right? They had a harem where they had a group of women that they enjoyed things with, pleasures, if you will. But their focus was mostly on producing children with those women in the harem. They weren't marrying those women. Suleiman is kind of the first of those sultans to marry one of the women in the harem, and that's a shift then of sultans marrying women in the harem. Roxelana is the first wife of a sultan. There would be several to follow her. Those women all began as slaves. They end up getting a considerable amount of power within the empire because, again, the reason being, women hold the social status of their husband. So if you are married to the sultan, you essentially hold the social status of the sultan. And unfortunately, this causes some conflict and contention with the viziers, the high-ranking officials that counsel the sultan. They were very opposed to these women having any sort of power They shouldn't be able to claim any kind of power, even though they were women who were married to the Sultan. So this is some sort of conflict and contention here between those two groups. Moving on into the Mughal Empire, and again, I got to move myself over. If we remember, we talked about the Mughal Empire in the last section as well. So we're going to kind of go back just a little bit to sort of talk about some of the social structure and religious diversity that existed. We've already touched on it before a few times. If we remember from previous units and, of course, the previous section, we talked about Akbar the Great, who was in power from 1556 to 1605. He is the one who expands the empire further into India, which puts the Mughal Empire, the Muslim empire, into territory that is predominantly Hindu. Right? The new territory has Hindus, has Sikhs, has Christians, right? And so Akbar wants to get those people, the Hindus, the Sikhs, and the Christians, to support the empire, support the Mughal Empire, which is predominantly Muslim. So what he does is he ends the jizya tax. We talked about that in the last section. And there's a huge period of unity and tolerance within the Mughal Empire. Now, in the last section, we talked about when that period ends under Aurangzeb. So we've kind of moved back just a little bit to sort of illustrate again the point of the religious tolerance and the religious diversity that exists in the Mughal Empire. So I wanted you to keep that in mind. Next, we're going to move into France, right? So we're sort of bouncing around a little bit and the power struggles that come with France. So remember in the last section, we talked about the Fronde uprisings that happened from 1648 to 1643. Those are a series of uprisings that are very complex, but generally speaking, to keep them in a general term, that has to do with the French nobility pushing back against the power of the king. They fail at their attempts and ultimately get quite the opposite, right? It strengthens the monarchy rather than weakens it, and would set up the reign of King Louis XIV, where the nobility, the landowning class, right, would face conflict with the king. The king declared himself absolute ruler, could rule without a chief minister. 1661 is when we see the beginnings of absolute monarchy. We talked about absolute monarchy in Unit 3. And again, this is sort of the end. After the Fronde uprisings, we see Louis XIV come in, basically put himself in power as the absolute monarch, and he says that the nobles don't really hold the power that they held anymore. And he brings them and invites them to live at the Palace of Versailles with him, starting in 1661. So this is when he starts to take away their power, starts to take away their influence and take away and put that into himself. And so this is the shift in the social structure of France. After the Fronde uprisings, the nobility, the wealthy do not have the power or influence they once held after King Louis XIV makes himself king. And we'll start to talk about later the French Revolution as well. That's coming up in Unit 5. So sorry, I think I missed a slide here. Give me 1 second. Yes, I did. There we go. So it is the Fronde Civil Wars that convinced King Louis XIV to eliminate what power was left for the nobility in the feudal system. Okay, so you see a struggle between the noble class and royalty, resulting in centralization of power in the monarchy in France. King Louis XIV is considered to be the first absolute monarch. We've touched on absolute monarchy before, but in case you need the definition, you have it there on the right. Absolute monarchy is a king or queen that rules a central state with total power. There's no limits, there's no law, or there's no law that can limit the power of the king. There's no religious rule that can limit the power of the king, no other institution that limits the power of the king. The king is the absolute ruler, right? Louis XIV is famous for saying that he is the state, right? So this is a shift. And ultimately, right, France would operate under absolute monarchy until the French Revolution in the late 1700s. And the consolidation of power into the hands of King Louis is a change in the role of the noble social class in France. So if we were to ask you what is a change in the social classes of France, right, it is the shift away from the role of the nobility, the power that the nobility had, and the shift to absolute monarchy under Louis XIV. Okay. Now, this next one for my pre-AP class, you can skip this one. This is a primary source for my AP students. You'll do this one on your own, and we'll talk about it later in class. But you can do this one on your own and answer the questions that follow this primary source. So you have 3 questions to answer there. What type of government was King Louis describing? And using what you know, talk about the struggle between the nobility and the monarch. So, as we wrap up, here are the things to review out of Unit 7 or Section 7. You have the Qing Dynasty led by the Manchus, marking a change in the status for the Han Chinese, the social classification that's based on race in Spanish America, Ivan IV limiting the power of the boyar class in Russia, Spain expelling the Jews through the Alhambra Edict in 1492, how the Ottoman Empire accepts the Jews from Spain, and adopts a tolerant policy, and how women change their role in status in the Ottoman Empire. And then lastly, of course, Akbar the Great, we touched on him just a bit, but ultimately, the other important part out of this one, not only the Spanish social classification, but also how Europe sees struggles between the noble class and the royalty, and how France becomes an absolute monarchy. So those are the key topics and key ideas for you to review out of this section.